Welcome back to Weekend Live. Now it is time for our Sunday political panel. Joining me is Ebony Bennett from the Australia Institute and Evan Mulholland from the Institute of Public Affairs. Good afternoon to you both. Thank you for joining me.
Good afternoon.
G'day.
Let's get straight into it. I want to begin with the aged care, of course, these revelations that have come out of the Aged Care Royal Commission. Evan, we'll start with you. The Prime Minister this week, he apologised several times about errors made during this pandemic. He also said that no one has ever had to deal with this before in terms of the Victorian aged care response. Given that other countries around the world had been dealing with this prior to Australia's outbreak, do you think that these issues were unforeseeable?
Yeah, look, I think with Scott Morrison, it was pretty refreshing to see a leader take responsibility and apologise for this issue. I don't think it's as much as a partisan issue as many are playing it out to be. The Liberal Party supported a lot of the Gillard and Rudd government's reforms to aged care during their time in government. Similarly, the Labor Party supported a lot of the Abbott government's reform and moves to consumer-centred care, which basically changed the funding model of aged care to match the NDIS, where money would go to people rather than big providers and give people more choice. But I want to sort of call out this public-private sector narrative that's being run by a lot of the union movement and the media, and Bill Shorten this morning on Insiders, to somehow assume that public providers are better than private providers. Only 4% of aged care facilities in Victoria are actually run by governments. And they're in areas like Bairnsdale, Yarrawonga, Warragul, Ballarat, largely where there's no market for aged care and where the virus hasn't been. So, of course, there's going to be less COVID in those aged care facilities. 55% of aged care facilities are actually non-profits run by charities, and religious orders and the like face extra regulation through bodies like the ACNC. And the union movement and some media want to dump them as private providers. Only 41% are actually for-profit providers. So this media narrative that somehow public facilities are better is just wrong. And I think it's important to have choice in aged care. If someone at their end of life wants to pay a bit extra for care that's curtailed to their priorities, I think they've earned the right to do that.
The report itself, Ebony, did say that an urgent response was still needed to protect the elderly and frail residents. The government has always maintained that it does have a plan for aged care, but given the death rate in Victoria, we know the majority have come from aged care residents. Do you think that the government has almost failed to protect them?
I think it's obvious that it has, and I think that's part of the reason why you saw the Prime Minister apologise and make an apology this week on that matter, because it does have ultimate responsibility. And even if, as it says, it did have a national plan, well, the plan was a failure, either in its conception or in its implementation, because those numbers now speak for themselves. And I think, the aged care sector through the Royal Commission, we can see, is one that was already groaning under pressure. It's got problems with its workforce. I do think there are problems with the amount of privatisation of the industry, and we're seeing some of those problems now, due to the pandemic, really come to the fore. And this is not a sector that needs less regulation, and I think the reality is it is going to need further government intervention. It is probably going to need much more government funding in the short term to get us out of this crisis, because the industry has not responded at all well, and certainly it seems like the federal government really failed to learn the lessons from those early outbreaks in aged care residential facilities in New South Wales, because whatever happened in Victoria, the plan that the government says was in place was a failure, and we have seen infections run through aged care facilities in the same manner as they have overseas. So if the buck stops with the federal government, it's one thing for the Prime Minister to make an apology or say that it was regretful, but they really just have to start doing better. And if that means a new minister, greater regulation, greater funding, well, we need to see some of those changes start to happen right now.
Another big report that came out this week, of course, was into the ill-fated Ruby Princess cruise ship. It found that there were serious and inexplicable errors by an expert panel from New South Wales Health. Evan, the report itself says that no minister should resign and that Border Force was not responsible for the mishap itself. Is it fair to say, though, that somebody needs to take responsibility here?
Absolutely, and the report was pretty scathing of New South Wales Health, and I think the responsibility for departments in a Westminster system lies with the minister. And Brad Hazzard is just not up to scratch given the way he's handled this, as well as the awful way he treated the New South Wales Leader of the Opposition. I think it's time for him to step down. The pandemic has really exposed just how poor performing some of our state government ministers are, with the Minister for Health in New South Wales, Brad Hazzard, and the Minister of Health in Victoria, Jenny Mikakos. But yeah, the report basically clears the Department of Home Affairs. It says, given the lack of epidemiological and medical expertise, they should bear no responsibility. So it's really a blow for Christina Keneally and all the Ruby Princess truthers out there in the media and on Twitter that were desperate for Peter Dutton or the Department of Home Affairs to bear responsibility. The report by Brett Walker was also pretty scathing of the taxpayer-funded ABC report, which claimed that a misreading of the flu tests were responsible by the Australian Border Force were responsible for the Ruby Princess outbreak. That was clearly wrong. And so I think, think the responsibility really lies with Brad Hazzard. And I think questions do need to be asked about the tenability of him going forward in that role.
Yeah, and the Premier says that she'll take the weekend to read the report, and we are expecting her to speak at some point this week. Ebony, do you think that ultimately the responsibility lies with Minister Brad Hazzard?
Yeah, I agree that the responsibility here lies with that. It seems to be the conclusion of this report. But I do think people could be forgiven for thinking that Border Force was supposed to be in control of this. I thought Samantha Maiden made a good point on Insiders this morning that it was the Prime Minister himself who announced the ban on all cruise ships coming into Australia, and that Border Force would be in charge of, quote, bespoke arrangements, unquote, to prevent people from disembarking who were infected. So, I think people could be forgiven, but the report has been clear in sheeting home blame and responsibility to the New South Wales government. And I agree that in a Westminster system, ultimately that responsibility lies with the Health Minister, who has clearly been not up to the task in this instance.
Let's talk about Melbourne's hotel quarantine system. The Defence Force this week confirmed that it had put troops on standby to monitor the system itself, but that was ignored by Daniel Andrews. There's been a bit of to and fro, I guess, Evan, on the matter this week between the Premier and the Defence Force. But given that the Army was used in other states but not in Victoria, and Melbourne, as we know, is the only state that has had problems with hotel quarantine, is it very important to get clarity on the matter as to what exactly has happened?
Absolutely, and I found it extraordinary in a parliamentary committee that Daniel Andrews would say the ADF just wasn't on offer for hotel quarantine. Not only did the Prime Minister announce it in his press conference and media release on the same day Daniel Andrews issued his own media release thanking the Prime Minister for the ADF support with hotel quarantine. So I think there is a greater need for transparency and accountability from the Victorian government, and it's just not forthcoming. And I want to call out this media narrative from the Virginia Triolis of the world that we need to be less partisan in a pandemic. I think that's just wrong. This Premier's and his government's mistakes have led to the greatest incursion of civil liberties in Australia's history. They've locked vulnerable people up in commission housing, put people under house arrest, introduced an unscientific curfew, scrapped any accountability by cancelling Parliament pretty much completely, and given themselves a pay rise for the privilege. So people do need answers, and they deserve them.
And as we know, this inquiry is still going, and we are expected to hear from some of the security guards this week, which will be interesting. But, Ebony, I mean, how important is it to get clarity on exactly who said what, and were the ADF approved to come into Victoria or not?
Well, I think that's important to a certain extent, but really the fault here looks like it does lie with the private security guards operating within the Victorian system. It sounds like I'm not sure how the recruitment of them was done, but that's where the infection control has lapsed, and whether they weren't provided with the right equipment or were lax about maintaining those infection controls. Security guards, that's not what recruited for, and perhaps deploying them in such a pandemic where they really are the front line of preventing the virus from escaping, was in error here. And because I think private security guards are still employed in other states and we haven't got elimination of this virus, potentially this is a problem that other states are going to face. So it's incredibly important to be transparent about what went wrong and to get to the bottom of it, because potentially such a weakness does exist in other states and they just haven't encountered it yet, because those other states have been much more successful at eliminating community transmission. But as we've seen in New Zealand, there's no guarantee that that will continue in the long term. So getting to the bottom of this and what went wrong with those private security arrangements, I think, is incredibly important for all the other states if we have future outbreaks, which seems entirely possible at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess more to come this week at that inquiry. Now, let's move on now. It's been fascinating to watch the debate between WA and Clive Palmer. And we know that the state this week passed extraordinary laws designed to block his potential $30 billion claim against the state. Evan, what do you make of this process?
This is just completely outrageous. They've overturned all natural justice provisions of the state in the case of Clive Palmer. They've removed procedural fairness. Any arbitration that he's won already is scrapped. Any proceedings he brings against the WA government gets thrown out, and all costs are thrown out as well and put on a Clive Palmer. This is the sort of thing you'd expect from a third world autocracy, not from a liberal democracy and a democratic state like WA. It's just outrageous. And it's the good and the bad with this WA government. They've just signed a commendable deal with the federal government to devolve environmental approvals to the state, which would increase resources projects in the WA. In the same vein, they've just massively increased sovereign risk, because who would want to invest in WA if a government is willing to overturn rules of natural justice just to get their way on an issue? They were clearly losing in their case and have just used legislation, and both parties should be condemned for it.
Ebony, your thoughts on this? Do you agree that, in terms of democracy, this completely goes against it?
I think there's a couple of concerning things about this case. Number one, I think the fact that one single mining magnate is involved in not one but two huge cases against the state government of Western Australia really shows the unchecked power of the mining industry that puts profits before anything else. And the iron ore that Clive Palmer is seeking to mine, he doesn't own that. That's the mineral wealth of all Australians. And I tend to agree with the constitutional law experts this week who said no matter which way this case ends up, really it's Western Australians who are going to miss out. I think on the one hand, it's very understandable that the WA government has sought to limit the damages from this case as a result of a decision from a Liberal Premier, from a decade ago, the details of which I think still remain quite unclear. But I do think Clive Palmer has a point about the legislation that was rushed through the Parliament and the real lack of transparency and accountability that we're seeing here. And we're seeing several troubling efforts from state and federal governments to avoid transparency and accountability. And this legislation that they've rushed through the Parliament is just one example. However, I do think it's important that state governments are able to retain the power to reject mining proposals and, they have to retain that ultimate power. The mining companies can't just do whatever they like, and that's important too. So I think probably no one wins from this case in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. A quick final word from both of you. This week, of course, the Palaszczuk government backflipped on its controversial laws that would have gagged journalists from reporting corruption complaints in the lead up to this year's election. Evan, a victory for the public's right to know, would you say?
Absolutely. This was an awful piece of legislation proposed by the state's Corruption Commission. A lot of advocates will claim these kind of corruption commissions will lead to greater transparency, but they end up becoming closed shops and personal fiefdoms for the people. We've seen examples with the New South Wales ICAC, how they become they go on witch hunts and they block accountability and they brief to selected media. This awful sort of piece of legislation is based on the mindset that people and voters can't make up their own mind about what information is dissected at an election, and that's just wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Ebony, your thoughts? Is this a victory for the public's right to know?
It absolutely is. And as I said before, I think this legislation was outrageous and is an example of state and federal governments really going out of their way to avoid transparency and accountability and to nobble anti-corruption commissions from doing their very important work because, you know, we know that there are problems with corruption all around states and territories and the Commonwealth as well. But we have seen, for example, the federal government make in the past 2 years to implement an anti-corruption commission federally after it promised to do so. But really, we need all states and the federal government to be more accountable, more transparent, and to make sure that the anti-corruption commissions have real teeth to deal with issues of corruption when they come up. But most importantly, to make sure that issues of corruption are dealt with in the public and exposed to the public, because sunlight is the best disinfectant.
Good analogy there. Ebony Bennett and Evan Mulholland, appreciate your analysis this afternoon. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you both.
Thank you.